All right, so coming back to this pickup in October of 1917, you see Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks seizing control of the government in Russia, so not getting elected, but conducting the forceful overthrow of the government. There you see a poster, one of the Bolshevik communist posters, declaring death to world imperialism. One of the things that happened with the communists seizing power was the drive to immediately end Russia's participation in the war. Arguably, that was one of the reasons why the provisional government never established itself in any firmer sense. Well, partly because it hadn't been around for very long, but also because the provisional government did not lift Russia out of the war when the abdication of the Tsar was predicated in part due to Russia's disastrous participation in the war. So from Russia's perspective, the war drags on all the way till October of 1917. Now, to be fair, it probably would have been difficult for the provisional government to negotiate a separate peace with Germany, which is essentially what they would have had to do. They would have risked isolating themselves vis-a-vis France and Britain. But unlike his predecessors, Lenin was intent on securing an immediate peace deal with Germany. He wanted to end the war quickly, but not for peace necessarily, because Lenin was actually not really a pacifist. He was more this kind of militant intellectual type. What he thought was going to happen was the next stage in the war, which was not going to be a bourgeois imperialist war, as he saw it, or a war between different nations. No, it was going to be a class war. That was basically his vision for what was going to happen subsequently, and he was intent on bringing about the next stage in a proletarian uprising. Proletarian meaning the workers of the world, the lower classes of the world, you could say. He thought if there was a peace agreement that Russia brokered, then there would subsequently be a workers' uprising in Germany. That Germany would overthrow its government, and thus a new stage of warfare would commence, but this would be a war to basically bring the communist revolution to the world as a whole. Important point there is that Lenin's vision is not really based on what's best for Russia, the nation, because he's not really thinking in those terms. He has an international dimension. His idea is that the Bolshevik revolution is going to be international. It's going to encompass all of Europe, and that underneath it all, we all belong to the same nation as such. It's really hierarchical class divisions, class distinctions. That's what separates people from one another. And he also thought that this was necessary for the destruction of the capitalist system, which was, after all, the main agenda of the communists underneath it all. They wanted to transition out of the material paradigm of capitalism and into a new world order founded on socialism. And again, to sort of be fair to his perspective, it did rather appear as though the older systems were tottering on the brink of destruction at this time, because capitalism, imperialism, nationalism, look at what they had produced with the war. So the war itself was just a sign for Lenin and other Marxist-inspired thinkers at this time of the total disintegration of the old social order. Now it's just a question of pushing things into the next stage. So that's basically what he has in mind when he signs this very rapid peace agreement with Germany. This treaty that was signed in March of 1918, which basically bequeathed a whole bunch of formerly Russian-held territory to the Germans. I mean, there was something like, I think the number I saw was 55 million people were suddenly kind of transferred out of the Russian Empire and suddenly were going to fall under German dominion. The Russian Revolution, the relevance to America, it ushered in America's long conflicted relationship with socialism, which would come to a head years later with the start of the Cold War, which would basically define international politics for the latter part of the 20th century, and is still relevant to this day if you pay any attention to American politics, if you see the kind of fight over the idea of socialism and its place potentially in the future future of America is as rampant and as strong as ever. So these things are still with us in the present day moment. On the one hand, America, speaking kind of collectively, had reason to fear the ideology of the new communist regime. And this seems to be one of those things that has been true since the start of this conflict. America, as a kind of assemblage, is intrinsically frightened and disdainful of the socialist ideology in general because it conflicts with how they see American values working, especially the ideals of capitalism, but also democracy as well. You can almost see it as an entire cultural ethos that is, from America's perspective, antithetical to everything they stand for. Now, keep in mind, during its inception, and one could argue the point up to this day, the communist ideology of Vladimir Lenin is quite an extreme ideology for the time, because they're really talking about just taking a torch to the existing social order and just burning everything down. All the kind of social systems that exist, all the kinds of domestic arrangements that exist, all those things should be remade, should be transformed. That's the kind of communist idea at this time. We're going to remake the entire social order, everything ranging from labor to marriage to individual rights to how we conceive of national differences, religious differences, very practice of religion, all these things torn down and transformed into something different. And so, yes, America could fear that as being a kind of radical ideology that opposes all the things that they have built. On the other hand, the deal that Lenin cut with Germany to end the war did seem to adhere to ideals of self-determination and anti-imperialism, so America kind of liked the peace agreement on the other hand. So it hasn't just been this kind of one-sided perspective. There has been ambiguity and conflict in terms of America's attitude towards socialism and communism from the start. Because yes, on the one hand, the Russian Empire had effectively just given away a whole bunch of its territory. You see the lighter green marking the former areas of the Russian Empire. But on the other hand, the key point was that the Russian Empire was an empire, and thus they had gained the territory through imperialism, because you know it was other nations, other ethnic groups that occupied the area. You had Poland, for instance, the Polish people. They're part of Russia previously, up until the war. So too with the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, even Finland. We're used to thinking of Finland as an independent country, part of the Russian Empire prior to this agreement. So yes, millions of people, 55 million people basically, quote, left the Russian Empire, but they were various groups of people who are not Russian. That was the kind of thing. So this peace agreement was in many respects a kind of anti-imperialist agreement from Lenin's perspective. He says, well, these were just imperialist occupations, which were basically bringing to an end. They're also based on the principles of self-determination. In other words, allowing the Finnish people, allowing the Polish people to chart their own trajectory and their own course in the future. There was, of course, the risk that these areas would become basically satellite states of Germany, but that did not end because the war ended shortly thereafter. This happens in March 1918. By November of 1918, the war is over. Following the money trail and a transfer of power, and this gets us back into the topic of, quote, winning the war, even the possibility of winning the war. America's participation in the war does happen right around the time of the provisional government coming to power in Russia, and America ultimately did provide resources and soldiers, but we shouldn't overstate the significance of that. America had been providing resources as this giant manufacturing country, and there were soldiers who started to arrive in increasing numbers in the summer of 1918. But the thing with the American soldiers were they lacked experience because they hadn't been involved in the war. They hadn't even really trained in America. They didn't have the equipment to train at the time. So you had these cartloads of soldiers coming into Europe. Well, they had to be trained initially. So their involvement in the war was a kind of slow-moving process, and their numbers only started to build up really when the war was already won. Neither of these things, as I said before, were as important as its main contribution, which was money. From 1915 onward, Wall Street basically bankrolled the Allies through massive private loans. America effectively took over the role of financing the war. And here's another idea you might remember from the British and European cultural history course. If you want to trace the trail of power within a capitalist society, just follow the money trail. And thus you will find where the power is actually coming from. And that was certainly the case with the war. America was running the war for the Allies. They weren't actually sending soldiers, but they were the ones who were financing the war. Thus they were gaining increasing power and authority and sway over what was happening in Europe. They were dictating the course of the war purely through cash. Again, just hard cash. Not even necessarily resources, but just massive loans that they were providing to Britain, France, and also Italy as well. The power dynamics were shifting considerably. They changed completely over the course of the war. Where once Paris had been a place that was a kind of financial center, suddenly it was just a needy borrower of credit as these countries sunk further and further into debt. The transfer of power, what did this ultimately signify? It symbolized the transfer of power to the United States. I mean, you could say America was kind of the victor in the war because this is ultimately what happened. America as having an outsized sway and importance in dictating policy in Europe because they're the ones with all the money. They're the ones who are controlling the debts. And we should not underestimate that point. I don't think it had happened previously at any other stage that a single nation had had this level of sway and influence over all of Europe. Britain had been a superpower, a global superpower during the height of the empire in the 1800s, but Britain never really came close to dictating what was happening in Europe in places like France or Germany. Once Germany was unified, they couldn't do that. Britain couldn't tell the countries of Europe what to do. They just didn't have that influence and power. But America was in a position to do that by the end of the war. Whatever kind of new world order was going to emerge in the post-war period was going to depend a lot on what America said. And as I say there, this is a curious point given ultimately what happened because America did not construct a lasting peace or harmonious agreement among the European nations in the 1920s and 1930s. Instead, what happened? Well, Europe completely disintegrated during that period, landed in an even worse war in the Second World War. So the end of the war itself, there you see a map showing the Allied gains. That would be the red area right there from the summer of 1918 to the armistice on November 11th. It seemed fairly evident by this point when we get into the summer that the Central Powers are losing the war, are going to lose the war. Notwithstanding the peace agreement with Russia, the financing of Britain and France, and also the belated arrival of American soldiers was clearly tipping the balance. Germany was going to lose the war at this juncture. But part of what's really interesting about the end of the First World War is there wasn't a total defeat. Germany, the Central Powers, never mounted this kind of dramatic last stand, and that was, or would be, a contrast to what happened at the end of the Second World War. Instead, there was this peace agreement and also the German Revolution. You can almost say the German Revolution, that was the collapse of the German Empire and the introduction of a republic, and also the peace agreement, the armistice, kind of interrupted the victory of the Allies, because the Allies were going to win the war. It was just a matter of time. But instead they brokered this deal in November, a kind of 11th hour deal, which sort of prevented a complete collapse of the German military and the Central Powers. So a little bit of a deviation there in terms of the set trajectory at this time. What's really intriguing about that was that this end to the war would play such a heavy ideological role in subsequent events, because what a sticking point this became for German nationalists, in particular one famous German nationalist named Adolf Hitler, who claimed that the German military had been cruelly stabbed in the back that the German military was willing to keep on with the fight, to fight to the last drop of blood. And it was a bunch of politicians and bureaucrats and Jewish people and socialists who basically snatched that away from them and kind of brokered this peace agreement behind their backs, thus committing this heinous crime against the German soldiers. I mean, that became one of the main narratives that Hitler and his fascists called upon to basically lever themselves into power and to also justify subsequent events. And that also became a kind of guiding principle for Hitler and his military, where there was no peace agreement at the end of the Second World War, not in 1945. That was a grueling, brutal fight to the very bitter end, until the invasion of Berlin. So the armistice could be considered, in a way, its own peace without victory, at least from the American standpoint. The Americans kind of got what they wanted in the end, a sort of intervention at the last moment to really prevent the victory from truly happening, and saying, no, let's make a deal at this point. Well, this also brought in a kind of conflict and ambiguity, which would be really fatal to the interwar period, because it seemed that the different competing nations, not just the Central Powers, but also the Allies, they had different interpretations of what the peace agreement was actually supposed to entail. And this is woven into the famous Treaty of Versailles, which was the treaty they eventually signed together. Now, obviously, Germany had its own idea of a peace agreement because, from their standpoint, they did not officially lose the war. Thus, they should not be treated as the losers in the war. But even the victors had different ideas about what this was supposed to entail. For instance, France was eager to secure reparations from Germany as quickly as possible. France wanted Germany to pay for the damage caused by the war, because a lot of the war was fought on French territory. So there had been destruction of different parts of France, but also the money factor. Let's not forget about the money factor. France was broke at this point. The country was bankrupt. And so they have all these debts that they're supposed to be paying to the United States. How exactly are they going to pay off these debts? Well, Germany can pay, right? That was their perspective at that time. Never mind that Germany's also bankrupt. There has to be a way for us to work around this. So Germany was going to pay France. France would pay America. And this would basically be the network of exchange which would proceed. Had disastrous consequences on the European economy, that model, because there was no money forthcoming anyway, so they had to kind of manufacture it out of thin air. The American contribution to the peace, which, as I said, this kind of idea of peace without victory, yes, the Allies in a sense had won the war, but from the American standpoint, everyone was kind of a loser here. Well, the main contribution was Woodrow Wilson's famous 14 points. You might have heard that term before. Basically a declaration of principles on international cooperation, and you could say really the foundation for the League of Nations, which was an international agreement among countries, and the League of Nations' more long-standing successor, the United Nations, today. The 14 points, you could almost say, laid the foundation for the UN, the United Nations that exists to this day in the 21st century. Basic idea of the 14 points was a statement promoting transparency and agreements among nations. So no more of these alliance systems that had pitted the countries against one another. You had an alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary originally. You had alliances between Britain, France, and Russia. Wilson's point, which is an accurate point, is all that does is pit the countries against each other and risk this total meltdown into a general war. Much better if we just have open exchanges among the countries, and if they are transparent and open about what they are trying to do and the agreements they're entering into. Also, the idea of financial entanglement among the countries, which would become so central to the European Union, is still central to the European Union today, the idea that the countries are all economically intertwined with one another. Wilson kind of had this idea as well. But lurking at the back of this statement was a vision of the American experiment as applied to Europe. Now, Wilson wasn't necessarily advocating that idea directly, but it was the kind of notion of what we should see in Europe are democratic republics. So republics, again, meaning not with a monarchy, not with a kind of hereditary system of succession, but with a constitutional system, and with suffrage as well, meaning with elected officials. So there was this idea, well, that should also be the model for Europe in the country, a bunch of democratic states. So as I say, America did have that kind of influence and sway over Europe. It could, in a way, bring its own vision to fruition. Its total failure to do so is one of the most interesting kind of facets of 20th century history, because, as I said before, instead of this cooperative agreement, instead of this kind of United Nations or European Union model, instead what you saw was Europe sliding down in the space of a generation into an even worse war. So there's this kind of idea, well, what the hell happened then? I mean, and this is the kind of conflictive point which could talk about for a long time. There you see the rumor the Bolsheviks executed the Romanovs of the family of Tsar Nicholas II in July 1918. So the monarch of Russia abdicates, but doesn't actually end up surviving, gets killed off by the communists. This is where they were digging out all the bullets from the wall. I'd say there, on the one hand, well, one aspect of America's idea of modern Europe did come to fruition since the interwar period did not feature a restoration monarchy, at least not on a big scale. I mean monarchy in the sense of, yes, the Russian Empire with the Tsar. There you have a monarchical system. But so too with the German Empire with the Kaiser. There you have a monarchy. Or Austria-Hungary as well, with the famous Habsburg dynasty. So this idea of the king or the monarch wielding absolute power, this authoritarian model. I mean, those things didn't really gain any traction in the interwar period. Yes, there were some people who wanted to restore the Russian monarchy, wanted to restore the German monarchy and the German Empire, but that was just one pressure group among various other ones that existed in Europe at the time. So from America's standpoint, you could see them saying, well, yes, exactly what we wanted, this Republican ideal. Do away with these old, antiquated, feudal systems, hereditary systems of succession. On the other hand, well, the kind of a worse thing happened in a way. Instead of restoration monarchy, you had an incredible surge in the very things that had started the war in the first place, namely imperialism and nationalism. If you look at interwar Europe, if you look at Germany with the fascist regime that came to power in the 30s, you look at Italy with Benito Mussolini's fascist regime, imperialism and nationalism, the foundations of those regimes which just gained more and more strength during this period. You even look at Russia and the Soviet Union, which we'll touch upon next time. The nationalistic construction of the Soviet Union, what that government actually became as they discarded the international agenda of the communists, as they developed their own imperialist agenda vis-a-vis Eastern Europe. It was the very forces that kind of came back with a vengeance into Europe. So nothing resembling America's idea of a cooperative peace agreement came to fruition at this time. As I say, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the Second World War. So, the interwar period, as far as the United States goes, the period known as the Roaring Twenties. A couple topics there to discuss. Industrial technology on an individual level, new versions of, quote, the individual, and crime and glamour. So the immediate period after the war. So the war ends, there's the armistice, and there's actually a kind of brief economic collapse that occurs in the United States and in parts of Europe as well. And that's mostly due to the collapse of the war economy. The thing with the war is it gives all sorts of people things to do. You had millions of young men who were soldiers at the time. Well, in the immediate aftermath of the war, they severely cut the military. So suddenly you had all these people who were enlisted, well, they're no longer soldiers, So what are they going to do? Well, you have a bunch of unemployed people suddenly. And so too with the war industry that it existed, there's really no question of what you should be building during a war. It's all weaponry and ammunition and uniforms. I mean, those are the things that the factories start churning out. Well, as soon as the war ends, well, nobody needs that stuff anymore. So you have to shift the economy in another direction. So there was this immediate kind of slump right after the war where you have a lot of industry shut down and you have a lot of unemployed people as well. And this was a period of rapid migration, especially into city centers. The most famous, which I'm going to talk about later on, was the so-called Great Migration of African Americans from the southern states up into the north. Especially in the east, but it would later happen to the west coast as well. Concentrations of African Americans in the southern states, the former Confederate states, and continued through most of the rest of the 1800s and the earliest part of the 1900s. But immediately after the war, you had their numbers, millions of people moving to places like Chicago, Detroit, DC, New York City as well. So a kind of influx or rush into city centers, urban centers. The movement of African Americans at this time, part of a larger movement of people into city centers and growing urbanization in America. That had already been a force in the late 1800s, but even more so at this time. However, after the brief post-war slump, there was a new surge of prosperity that took hold. Expanding cities emerged as centers of affluence, entertainment, and culture. And you could say that this is where America really starts to come into its own as a center not only of wealth production, which had been the case in the late 1800s, but also as a kind of a cultural center as well, with the outflowing, the outpouring of affluence, fueling new industries and new cultural forms. This became an era of a new consumer culture, a period associated with booms in the automobile, aviation, and cinema industries, and that's just to name a couple of them. Automobiles, well, there had been cars that were invented, but it was the mass production of automobiles that made them more of a consumer product, something that was more widely available to individual people. Henry Ford, with his famous innovations with the assembly line, which allowed for the production of cars very quickly, rapidly turned Detroit into a fast-growing urban center, and suddenly cars were distributed on a mass scale. Aviation, well, I mean, there were airplanes. They existed prior to the war, and there were airplanes during the war. They played a somewhat minor role, but the growth of aviation as a thing, as an industry, was especially prominent during the 1920s. There was the first solo transatlantic flight. Charles Lindbergh famously made that trek across the Atlantic in 1927, I believe it was. I forget how many hours it took him to do that, but a lot of hours, right? Because he flew much slower back in those days. And eventually aviation, flying would become not just a kind of domestic industry, but a major factor in the Second World War. As I said, airplanes did play a role in the First World War, but not really a determinant factor, but a huge factor in the Second World War. And also, how about cinema as well, the film industry, which started to just take off during this period. This was the period where they were introducing sound into motion pictures. There were movies previously, but they didn't have sound originally. And this was the period where you saw the development of the so-called talkies, which basically meant films that had people speaking aloud, speaking dialogue out loud. Not a thing that existed previously with movies. You would have just silent films set to music, and when the characters would speak, you would just put the text up on the screen, basically in captions, because they were not able to capture them speaking aloud. But during the 1920s, they started to introduce this idea of characters in movies speaking to one another so you could hear them. Incidentally, the introduction of the talkies actually killed off the careers of various silent movie actors. So all the big stars back in the day, suddenly no one wanted to hear their voices, right? They only worked as silent film actors, so a whole crop of new movie actors, movie stars entered the realm. This is a point I mentioned previously, both last semester and in this class. World War I was one manifestation of the Industrial Revolution. Now, it certainly took a long time, and it just goes to show that when you talk about something like the Industrial Revolution, this sweeping transformative change in human behavior, well, how does it manifest itself? And one glib answer is that it manifests itself in all ways, that it influences everything that we can imagine, everything ranging from labor to family life to dwellings, the places people live, the stuff we do on a day-to-day basis, etc., etc. Yeah, it also influences war. It changes the complexion of war, turns it into something totally different than what it had been previously. And that was certainly true of the Industrial Revolution and World War I. The introduction of industrial technology into warfare, the development of weaponry like the machine gun and giant battleships like the dreadnought, the tank later on, just totally changes what war is, and largely responsible for the absolute destructive impact of the First World War. Well, here you see a kind of another version of the Industrial Revolution, a much more benign version of it, we would say. Here is where industrialization reaches the level of the individual consumer. Again, it took a long time, because when we talk about industrialization, the introduction of the steam engine and steam power, that was happening way back at the end of the 1700s. So note the long lag and delay. But here we are in the early 1900s, and you see a whole bunch of individual consumer products which are built on the principles of industrialization. As I said before, automobiles, cars, for instance, industrial machines, suddenly those are available on an individual level. You can own your own car. Of course, they produce all sorts of fantastic cars in the 1920s. Also radios, electric lighting, vacuum cleaners, washers, dryers, refrigerators, etc. So all these small products, they're all things that use electricity. They're all built on industrialization, and it's the kind of individualization of the revolution. It comes into people's homes, it comes into their lives, and reshapes how they live their lives, changes the nature of labor, changes the nature of transportation, changes the nature of domestic chores. All these things take on a new face during this period. The 20s featured the personalization of industrial technology. They also introduced new forms of individuality as well. You could talk about the kind of democratization of industrial technology, the democratization of politics as well, with increasing voting rights. Well, also just the kind of notion of the individual as someone free and independent, belonging to different social groupings. This was a period of a kind of free-spirited bohemian and a liberated identity, all of it emerging under the kind of umbrella term of the Jazz Age, which jazz refers to a type of music, of course, but also kind of encapsulates an entire mentality, a kind of a party, circuit, freewheeling mentality that took off during the 1920s. All sorts of image productions of new and subversive identities emerged at this time, including the figure of the new woman, which was quite a contrast to a kind of Victorian ideal of what women are supposed to be. The new woman as someone liberated, independent, someone who might drive on her own, have her own career, be basically someone who is free from the doctrinaire of society. You could say from one perspective, it seemed that an old world sense of morality had been destroyed in the war. I mean an old world sense of morality in terms of kind of a very prudish and repressive interpretation of human behavior, especially sexuality, because that had been quite repressive, at least in the mainstream of Victorian society and the early part of the 20th century. Well, the war just gutted and shattered a lot of things, including people's just traditional interpretations of things like sexuality, because suddenly there was a much more sexualized and bohemian atmosphere in the 1920s, a kind of liberation from an old world morality that had been killed off in the war. see the production of various advertisements, many of which revolved around glossy images of glamorous people living in city centers. You'd have to say that both Emerson and Dewey's vision of the archetypal American figure was sort of shunted to the side. This was not about the rustic, pioneering type of person, the cowboy who lives independently out on the frontier doing his own thing. Now, this is much more about the kind of the glamour shot of a sophisticated person, well-dressed, well-groomed, living in a city center, and you can see the kind of image production of people you should be like or people you should want to be, and caught up, of course, with a massive advertising industry, smoking Lucky Strikes, for instance, to stay in shape for men, to play tennis, drinking Orange Crush. I mean, there's just a whole series of different images that emerge at this time. These are potential models to emulate, as is always the case with advertising campaigns, the idea of you should be like this. I mean, that's basically the kind of idea of these promotional narratives. They're giving you an image of someone that you should aspire to emulate, whether it's a rock star or a TV star, or whether it's just a good-looking person on the screen, the image, so a model to emulate, but also an image of what Americans were starting to become as well. So it kind of flows the other way as well. The idea of this is who we are now. This is the kind of modernization of the American person, the American citizen. And you can see the way that this consumer culture operates among products, among goods, among services, but also among people. The idea of the person, the individual, as a product for sale, as someone kind of a valuable thing in the world. That's something we can see sort of taking hold more in the 1920s. This idea of you yourself are valuable. You yourself are worth something just by dint of being an individual. But because you're worth something, you better look your best. You better have your best face on and the best image production possible. Figures that summed up this era, well, Babe Ruth, the famous baseball player, an icon of the 1920s, who kind of encapsulated the roaring 20s better than this person who started out playing baseball in Boston, was actually a pitcher initially, one of those kind of forgotten details of history, before he switched to batting full-time as a slugger and became the figure of someone who could hit home runs. I mean, that became his kind of iconic thing. And talk about kind of capturing the sort of the bigness and excess of an entire era. The baseball home run, someone who just stands there, swings a bat, hits the ball as hard and as far as he can. That kind of glamour and glory became attached to a figure like Babe Ruth, and he shattered all sorts of home run records over the course of the 1920s repeatedly. But he also became this kind of paragon for the excessive bohemian lifestyle with his basic predilections, his involvement with alcohol, with women, with staying out all night. I mean, he's the kind of person who would have given fits to modern coaches and managers today. I mean, you couldn't keep him in a room for any length of time. That kind of idea of the sort of excess, the bigness, someone who lives the American dream. Someone who becomes a star on the big stage and can kind of go out and do whatever he wants. That was sort of coordinated with a single person. And Babe Ruth, someone who definitely emblematized, personified the American dream in the sense that he came from total obscurity. Not someone who was born into a prominent family, but someone who grew up in this impoverished background. Babe Ruth was also this savior for the American national pastime following the Black Sox scandal. And this is the last thing to mention here. This was a huge scandal that occurred in the year 1919 when a group of baseball players for the Chicago White Sox conspired to fix the World Series. So they basically lost the series on purpose to another team. And they did that because a bunch of gamblers, professional gangsters had got hold of them and had encouraged them to do this in exchange for a cash payout. And I would say that this kind of dynamic also informed the 1920s, because here you have baseball, known as the American national pastime, and it does have this very sort of wholesome veneer to it. The idea of baseball being caught up with American suburban life and little kids playing Little League or sons and fathers playing catch in the backyard, it sort of captures a certain aspect of American culture. Well, that was the sort of idea of baseball as a national pastime, but gangsters and gamblers were involved in the sport. Certainly had been involved prior to 1919. It just hadn't broken in this way. Go to baseball players and say, hey, I'll give you $5,000 if you lose this game. And they would do it. Because, I mean, baseball players were just chronically underpaid at this time. So this kind of, involvement with a sort of ideal of Americana, but also with the corruption and crime woven into it at the same time. That's why Babe Ruth was this kind of savior for the sport, just because he directed attention away from the scandal during the 1920s. So yeah, let's leave it there for today. I'll come back and finish with the last of this, talk about the beginning of the Depression and get into the Second World War. So enjoy the rest of the week.